5. Ancient Florida man was a giant. Concealing evidence that conflicts with accepted theory is common scientific skullduggery. For years, the Smithsonian Institution has been accused of hiding in storage vaults things it doesn't like. Vincent H. Gaddis, American Indian Myths and Mysteries. Florida man has been called the world's worst superhero. And with some of the headlines mentioned earlier, rightfully so. But there was a time when Florida man at least had the physical makings of a superhero. In days gone by, Florida man was tall and robust, standing at over 7 feet tall, and if stories can be believed, possibly reaching 12 feet in height. Newspaper stories from the 1800s and early 1900s told the story of these mighty men of renown, as the Bible called them. According to a piece in the Palm Beach Post that ran on October 2, 1934, the continual wash of the Atlantic Ocean cutting through a narrow coastal island about 1 mile south of the St. Lucie Inlet has exposed the bones of men evidently laid to rest 100 years ago, says the Fort Pierce News-Tribune. Skeletons of 9 individuals were discovered, some in the shallow waters of the inlet and others beneath the nearby sand. All of the men were unusually tall and must have been sturdy giants in their day. One jawbone taken from the site measured 8.5 inches from the joint of the jaw to where it hinged on the skull. One shin bone was almost twice the length of an ordinary shin bone today. On November 20, 1938, the Palm Beach Post reported a mass giant burial inside a mound. One of these Indian mounds, not far from Jensen, yielded nearly 50 skeletons of 7-foot men, and it was estimated that nearly 1,000 bodies were buried here, probably after a battle. So anyone may take up this interesting study at their leisure. The New Smyrna Daily News told of an enormous thigh bone in their August 29, 1913 issue. Who were the men of stature so great that a thigh bone measured 38 inches in length? Men who once roamed through the Everglades of Florida? And how many years ago did people of such great size become extinct? J.F. Carlisle and J.T. Brown of this city were struggling around in the glades the first of the week, noticing the effect of the unusual dry season and essaying to locate a special tract of land. They were some 8 miles west of this city and a little north. Suddenly, they noticed upon a pine that was about 3 feet through an indication of a blaze, and investigation showed that at one time it was heavily and well defined. But time had healed so much of it that less than 2 inches remained. And its height from the base of the tree was unusual. Its slowest portion was about 8 feet from the ground, its upper commencement between 10 and 11, showing that it must have been made from a boat when 3 or 4 feet of water covered that spot by a person standing upon some object or by a person of unusual size. Hardly had the two ceased wondering at the almost covered blaze when, a little way from the base of the tree, was found what bore every indication of being a thigh bone of a human being, except that its length was abnormal. It measured, as it lay upon the ground, 38 inches long, but every effort to preserve it intact proved of no use. It crumbled at every touch. Both Mr. Brown and Mr. Carlisle are ready to make affidavit as to the length, and believe it to be the bone of a human leg from the thigh to the knee. An August 27, 1927, Woodville Republican article told the story of ancient giant Floridians. Giant Indians who roamed Florida swamps 500 years or more, living on shell foods which they cracked with their teeth, is a picture unfolded by archaeologists who have delved into a burial ground on a Gulf island near here. The skeletons were discovered on a small section of land where a lone fisherman has lived for years. Scientists estimated that the bones are at least 500 years old and are remains of a tribe known as Caribs, natives of the West Indies. They are believed to have inhabited the state and adjacent islands before the Spaniards in Florida. The skulls, larger than those of current history, battered and crushed, indicated tribal battles. The jaw and teeth are unusually large. Likewise are the body, bones, indicating the Indians of past ages were veritable giants in comparison with those today. Mounds similar to the one in which the bones were unearthed are common in this state. The bones have been sent to the Smithsonian Institution for further examination. It is interesting that the article noted discoverers sent the bones to the Smithsonian. In countless similar articles from places far and wide, the reports say the same thing. The bones were sent to the Smithsonian. Yet today, the Smithsonian claims they do not have any such skeletons. Not only that, but they also claim they have no knowledge of the skeletons and backhandedly dismiss claims of a cover-up. I am not suggesting the Smithsonian is currently engaged in a conspiracy to hide giant bones from the public, but what I am saying is that at one time they had the bones. Personally, I believe they were dumped into the Potomac River decades ago. They probably sent any remaining bones to various Indian tribes for burial after the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, became law in 1990. Circling back to news reports of giants, the Evening Independent, a St. Petersburg newspaper, ran an article titled "Skull Found Indicates Previous Floridians Were Sizable" on February 14, 1925. Length of a bone was 63 centimeters, 1/4 larger than that of a normal modern man, together with bones indicating a probable height of not less than 7 feet today, led to speculation over theories of a giant race believed to have inhabited Florida before the coming of the Spaniard. The Advertiser, a newspaper from Adelaide, South Australia, wrote a follow-up piece on May 18, 1925. Discovery of a skull 1/4 larger than that of the normal modern, together with bones indicating a probable height of not less than 7 feet, leads to speculation over theories of a giant race believed to have once inhabited Florida. Huge skeleton found. The portions of the skeletons were found by workmen grading a road near Charlotte and Lee County lines. The bones are believed to be those of a male. The specimens are to be shipped to the Smithsonian Institution. Providence, Rhode Island newspaper, the News Tribune, wrote of a Duval County find on May 5, 1929. Mr. Alexander Zermis of Dunn's Lake has found skeletons of a bygone race in the mounds on his plantation 9 feet long, and, what is of more importance to Mr. Zermis, traces of gold also. Most giant discoveries listed in newspapers come from the mid to late 1800s and continue through the 1930s. But this Ocala Star-Banner article made it to print as late as October 19, 1959. Tampa, AP. Discovery of a burial mound containing a skeleton 7 feet long was reported today by a Tampa policeman. Richard Del Valle and his cousin Larry Lopez, 16, found several of the mounds on a deserted island off the Florida west coast, north of Fort Myers. There is a legend, Del Valle said, that a race of tall people occupied Florida before the Indians. Lopez, a resident of Pine Island, found several mounds on a nearby island. He dug through a layer of conch shells to uncover one of the mounds and found the skeleton. He did not disturb the bones because they were in fragile condition. De Valle said the University of Florida would be asked to send an anthropologist to look at the skeletons. These have been but a few of the discoveries of giant skeletons from the Sunshine State that made it into the newspapers. Skeptics are quick to dismiss these kind of reports, even though there are hundreds from all over the nation. But I do not understand why. Myths and legends from around the globe testify to the existence of giants in the past. And if that is not enough, there are records of historical encounters with the mighty men of renown. DeSoto and the Sons of Anak. While I was camped along the Peace River in Hardy County in February 2022, the wife and I took a drive west along Highway 64 to Bradenton. The bulk of the drive took us through vast orange groves and enormous cattle ranches, the Florida that folks seldom see. People are quick to criticize the Sunshine State for its continuous strip malls running alongside both coasts, but the middle of the state is quite different. Truthfully, I never paid much attention to the strip mall remarks. After all, I grew up in Virginia, where strip malls are as much of a part of the scenery as cow pastures and forests, especially in northern Virginia, the Tidewater area, and Richmond suburbs. Once we reached Bradenton, we stopped at a couple of beaches and walked around, enjoying the sunshiny 80-degree February weather. After that, we drove around town and then on to Anna Marie Island for a couple of hours of sightseeing. On our way back to the campground, we stopped at the DeSoto National Memorial on the outskirts of Bradenton. The 26-acre memorial commemorates the Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto landing in Sarasota Bay in 1539 to lead an expedition through the southeastern United States. Well, maybe. Some think De Soto landed in Port Charlotte, while others place his landing closer to Tampa. Regardless, he came ashore somewhere on the west coast of Florida and led an expedition of 600 men through the present-day southeastern United States. Not long after landing in Florida, the De Soto expedition party encountered a white man, half-naked and covered in tattoos, who had been living among the Mocoso people for over a decade. His name was Juan Ortiz, and he was captured in 1528 after coming ashore while searching for signs of the ill-fated Narvaez expedition, which had landed in Tampa Bay a year earlier. Ortiz was to be executed, but the chief's daughter begged for his life, the original Pocahontas story of the New World. Ortiz joined the De Soto expedition. Having learned the Timucuan language, plus knowing several other dialects, Ortiz was invaluable as an interpreter. However, many in the expedition party did not trust Ortiz, as he refused to dress as the other Spaniards and would often camp with local Indian friends rather than the expedition party. The De Soto expedition encountered large natives which stood a foot taller than the Spanish in Florida. The cacique chief of Ocala, like many Indian rulers, was of enormous stature and described as an Indian of enormous size and amazing strength. As De Soto headed north, he met what his chroniclers called a true son of a neck in present-day Alabama. And there we saw the giants, the sons of a neck, which come of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. Numbers chapter 13, verse 33, King James Version. According to the account of the Spanish historian Garcilaso de la Vega, De Soto spent over a week in the town of Talice. During this time, a powerful chief in the area named Tuscaloosa sent his son to meet with De Soto. Tuscaloosa's son was about 18 years old and was an enormous man who stood taller than any of De Soto's men or the Indians who were part of the expedition. Garcilaso de la Vega said in his work, The Florida of the Inca, "In the meantime, the son of Tuscaloosa visited him. He was a young man, about 18 years of age, but so tall that he exceeded in height by nearly half of his body all the Spaniards and all the Indians in the army. Tuscaloosa's son led De Soto to him. Tuscaloosa was waiting in a village named after him. Garcilaso de la Vega described Tuscaloosa as a giant of a man. Tuscaloosa was 40 years of age or thereabouts, and 2 feet higher than those who accompanied him, so that he appeared a giant. His face, his shoulders, and the rest of his body corresponded with his height, and he was large in proportion, a handsome man of proud and noble men, the best formed and greatest that they had yet seen in Florida." One of De Soto's captains, Gonzalo Silvestre, described Tuscaloosa in the following way: "The chief was a true son of a neck, standing a head and shoulders height above his men." De Soto and his men stayed in the village of Tuscaloosa for a couple of days before heading to the town of Mabila. Tuscaloosa had told De Soto provisions for the expedition would be waiting there. Tuscaloosa accompanied De Soto and his men on the way to Mabila. The enormous chief was too heavy to ride on the standard horses the Spanish used, and had to ride a pack horse. Silvestre wrote the following in his book Hernando de Soto: "Soto, who when he wished to honor a great chief always had a quiet horse prepared for him to ride, was sadly put to it by the chief's stature and his bulk. No horse in all his army could carry him, and when at last a sturdy baggage animal was found to bear his weight, the Indian's feet were almost to the ground. The cunning Tuscaloosa led De Soto into a trap. Mabila was heavily fortified, and when De Soto arrived, one of his scouts saw there were no women or children around. Shortly thereafter, men emerged from hiding, firing arrows at De Soto and his men. De Soto retreated from Mabila, but he and his army quickly regrouped and launched a vicious attack. De Soto's party killed 2,500 Indians at the Battle of Mabila. 200 conquistadors died, and 150 were wounded. De Soto burned Mobila to the ground and continued his expedition. He headed in a northwesterly direction, marching through Mississippi and into Arkansas before turning south. Shortly after crossing the Mississippi, De Soto's most celebrated accomplishment, he fell ill and died in a village on the western bank of the river. Luis de Moscoso Alvarado assumed command of the expedition after De Soto died. Moscoso got as far western Texas before retracing his steps to the site of De Soto's death. From there, Moscoso and his men began a long return to Spain by building rafts and floating down the Mississippi River and into the Gulf of Mexico. Those who survived the epic float trip reached Mexico and then returned to Spain, where their countrymen viewed the expedition as an abject failure. When I visited the De Soto National Memorial, I kept thinking of the Indians in Florida that stood a foot taller than the Spanish. I recalled a 2020 trip to the Etowah Mound site in Georgia. De Soto had marched through this part of the country during his expedition, and a display in the museum caught my eye. It spoke of the ancient practice of cradle boarding, or skull flattening. A flattened skull was a mark of beauty or rank. The deformation of the skull, done in infancy while the bones were still soft, produced no ill effects. I recalled how cultures around the globe used cradle boarding to signify they belonged to the upper echelon of society. It seems obvious they were mimicking something or someone they had seen. They were attempting to look like the gods. Around the globe, these skull-flattening traditions are also linked to people of enormous physical stature. So, naturally, another display in the museum grabbed my attention. It read, "When the Spanish came to the southeast, they found healthy people who were, on average, larger than Europeans." Spanish explorers often commented on the tall and robust chiefs they met. Their larger size may have been the result of a privileged diet. Maybe so, but with the wealth of traditions and stories of large Indians and downright enormous chiefs, it seems as if something else were at play in America. Something more akin to a practice of selective breeding, producing an elite bloodline, which handed down giant genes. That is a lot more than I would like to get into in this book. For more on the subject, read Ross Hamilton's book, A Tradition of Giants, The Elite Social Hierarchy of American Prehistory. At any rate, I had a great time visiting the De Soto National Memorial in Bradenton. I couldn't help imagining seeing the land as De Soto saw it. What a sight it must have been. And although his expedition was plagued with failure from the onset, what a nice place to start. There is a nature trail that cuts through the woods and follows much of the shoreline, which I walked on a fabulous blue sky, warm February day. The French. Like their Spanish counterparts, French explorers also had encounters with real-life sons of a neck in Florida. French naval officer and Hyung No Sean Ribot led an expedition to the New World and landed on Florida's shores in the spring of 1562. Sometime after landing in Florida, the explorers headed north and reached present-day South Carolina. Here, the Indians told them of a land named Savola. A giant ruled Savola, and gold and silver were so abundant that the precious metals held no value to the Indians. After establishing an outpost on Parris Island, South Carolina, Ribault returned to France. In August 1565, Ribault returned to America and took control of Fort Caroline, a French colony located in present-day Jacksonville, Florida. The colony was short-lived. The Spanish sacked Fort Caroline on September 20th. On October 12, 1565, Spanish soldiers killed Ribault. Jacques Lemoyne de Moux accompanied Ribault on the expedition. Lemoyne was an artist whose drawings left a historical record of Native American culture, colonial life, and plants in the New World. Theodore de Bry used one of Lemoyne's drawings in an engraving that shows a Timucuan chief of enormous stature. The chief was named Athor. He is depicted showing René Laudonnière a monument Jean Ribault erected before his death. The Timucuans themselves were renowned for their height and well-built physiques, and for being physically fit. The average Timucuan was several inches taller than a typical European.